On May 10th, 1869, a crowd gathered on a stretch of high desert in Utah Territory called Promontory Summit to watch two locomotives roll toward each other until their pilots nearly touched. A photographer named Andrew Russell lifted his camera and captured the moment. Two rail lines, one built east from Sacramento and one built west from Omaha, finally joined into a single continuous track across the continent. The picture became one of the most reproduced images in American history. Workers climbed onto the engines. Men in suits shook hands. Champagne bottles were passed hand to hand. Of the roughly 12,000 Chinese laborers who had spent 4 years blasting, digging, and hauling the Central Pacific's half of that line through some of the hardest terrain in North America, not one appears clearly in the photograph. Their names rarely appear in the payroll ledgers either, at least not in a form any descendant could later trace. What survives instead is scattered: a county of origin, a labor contractor's tally mark, a surname recorded a dozen different ways by clerks who did not speak the language of the men they were paying. When genealogists and geneticists began, more than a century later, to reconnect modern American families to the men who built this railroad, what they found runs directly against the story stitched into that one famous photograph. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Congress had authorized the whole project in July of 1862 when Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act into law in the middle of a civil war that made a rail line to the Pacific feel less like ambition and more like survival. The act created two companies and split the continent between them. The Central Pacific Railroad would build east out of Sacramento, California. The Union Pacific Railroad would build west out of Omaha, Nebraska. Wherever the two lines eventually met, that point would mark the end of the project, and the two companies raced toward it, because Congress paid both of them in land grants and government bonds for every mile of track laid. The Central Pacific's four principal investors, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, were Sacramento merchants who had made their money selling hardware and dry goods during the gold rush, not railroad men by training. The route over the Sierra Nevada had been surveyed and championed by an engineer named Theodore Judah, who spent years convincing skeptics that a railroad could cross those mountains at all before he died of yellow fever in 1863, months after construction began and years before he could see whether his route would work. It worked, but barely, and only because of a decision Crocker made in 1865 that his own construction supervisor, James Strobridge, initially refused to carry out. White laborers kept quitting. Sacramento's job market was thin, San Francisco's was thinner, and the men who did sign on for railroad work often walked off within weeks for the mining camps, where the pay looked better and the work looked easier. Crocker suggested hiring Chinese laborers, several thousand of whom were already in California from the gold rush years and the agricultural labor market. Strobridge doubted whether men he considered too small for the work could handle it. Crocker pushed anyway. A trial crew of about 50 Chinese workers went out onto the grade in early 1865, and within months Crocker was hiring by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Most of them came from a cluster of counties in Guangdong Province in southern China, an area local immigrants called Soyup, the 4 counties, along with a smaller number from the neighboring Samyup district, the 3 counties. Toishan, the largest of the 4, sent so many of its sons across the Pacific that the Toishanese dialect, not the Cantonese spoken in Guangzhou, became the working language of early Chinese America. Few of these men traveled on their own initiative the way European immigrants crossing the Atlantic did. Most arrived through a credit ticket system run by labor brokers and financed through family and district associations in San Francisco, organizations collectively known to Americans of the period as the Six Companies, which advanced the cost of passage and expected repayment out of wages earned on American soil. Their names entered the historical record in a form few descendants could later use. Paymasters recorded workers by a single anglicized syllable, a nickname, or a work gang number rather than a full family name written in a consistent romanization. A man whose family called him Chin might appear in a ledger as Ah Chin one week and China Charlie the next. Multiply that inconsistency across roughly 12,000 men working under dozens of subcontractors over 4 years, and the paper trail that should connect a modern American family to a specific great-great-grandfather on the Central Pacific payroll mostly does not exist. What survives with more confidence is the county: Toishan, Sunhui, Hoiping, Yanping. If a family history says a great-great-grandfather worked on the railroad and came from one of those 4 counties, the geography lines up with the documented labor pool even when the name in the ledger does not. The work itself nearly matched the danger of the war the country had just finished fighting. Crews blasted 15 tunnels through solid granite in the Sierra Nevada. The longest of them, the Summit Tunnel near Donner Pass, took more than a year of round-the-clock drilling and detonation to finish. Winters in the Sierra during those years buried work camps under snowdrifts 40 feet deep, and avalanches killed workers whose bodies were not recovered until the spring thaw, sometimes still standing upright in the position where the snow had caught them. Nitroglycerin, more powerful and less stable than standard blasting powder, was mixed on site because shipping the finished explosive over the mountain roads was considered too dangerous, which meant the men handling it were manufacturing bombs by hand at high altitude in freezing temperatures. Chinese workers were paid less than white workers doing the same job and were required in the earlier years of the project to provide their own food and shelter out of that lower wage, while white laborers had board included. In June of 1867, an estimated 3,000 Chinese workers along a stretch of the grade near the summit walked off the job at once, demanding wages equal to white laborers, an 8-hour day in the tunnels, and an end to the practice of whipping foremen striking workers. Central Pacific responded by cutting off food supplies to the strikers' camps and waiting them out. Within 8 days, the strike collapsed for lack of provisions, and the men went back to work without the raise. It remains one of the largest labor strikes in 19th century America, and for decades it appeared in almost no popular account of how the railroad got built. By the spring of 1869, the two railroads were grading parallel and sometimes overlapping lines through Utah, racing for mileage payments, with no meeting point yet fixed by Congress. On April 28, the Central Pacific crew, made up almost entirely of Chinese laborers, laid 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single working day, a bet Crocker had made with Union Pacific's Thomas Durant that has never been matched by hand labor since. 8 Irish rail handlers were selected to appear in the newspaper accounts of the feat, setting the individual rails in place as the Chinese crews behind them graded the bed, distributed ties, and drove the spikes that held everything down. The 10-mile day remains, on paper, a record credited to Central Pacific as a company. The men who actually built it are not named in most of the coverage that made the record famous. Union Pacific, building west out of Omaha across open prairie rather than granite, drew a different workforce for different reasons. Irish immigrants, many of them recent arrivals from a famine generation still landing at eastern ports, made up the largest single group. Many of the workers on both crews were Civil War veterans, Union and Confederate alike, hired without much regard for which uniform a man had worn 4 years earlier, because a graded railbed did not ask a man his politics, only his back. Formerly enslaved men, recently freed by the war's end, found paid work on Union Pacific crews moving west through Nebraska, in numbers large enough that period accounts note them specifically, though their names, like the Chinese names on the other end of the line, rarely survive in a form a descendant could trace today. German immigrants filled out surveying and engineering crews alongside a smaller number of Scandinavian laborers recruited directly off immigrant ships in New York, with the promise of railroad wages. The man running Union Pacific's engineering effort, Grenville Dodge, had commanded Union troops during the war before Lincoln personally asked him to take charge of the railroad survey west of the 100th meridian. Dodge's work camps moved with the railhead itself, temporary towns of saloons, gambling tents, and boarding houses that sprang up wherever the track currently ended and vanished a few weeks later when it moved on, a pattern contemporaries nicknamed Hell on Wheels. Names attached to those towns, North Platte, Julesburg, Cheyenne, are better documented than the individual men who passed through them, because the towns eventually became permanent and the workers, by and large, did not stay. Protecting those crews as they pushed into land the Cheyenne, Lakota, and Arapaho intended to defend fell largely to a unit called the Pawnee Scouts, organized under two brothers, Frank and Luther North, and made up of Pawnee men enlisted from a reservation in Nebraska. The Pawnee had their own long history of conflict with the tribes. Union Pacific's construction was now provoking, and the Scouts' service is documented in Army records in more individual detail than most of the railroad's own laborers. A strange reversal in a project otherwise defined by how little of its workforce made it into the written record by name. In Utah, both companies signed grading contracts with Brigham Young, who saw the railroad as the fastest way to end the isolation that had defined Mormon settlement in the territory for 2 decades. Young supplied laborers, many of them young men from Salt Lake City, Ogden, and the settlements along the Wasatch Front, to grade sections of roadbed for both Central Pacific and Union Pacific in the final push through Weber Canyon and Echo Canyon. The work paid poorly and inconsistently. Central Pacific in particular fell badly behind on payments owed to Young's crews, a dispute that dragged into litigation and left hard feelings that outlasted the railroad's completion by years. Family names common in early Utah settlement, Young among them, along with Woodruff, Kimball, and Snow, appear in the same ledgers as construction payments and land claims tied directly to those grading contracts, though most descendants today know the ancestor as a settler or a church figure rather than specifically as a railroad grader. What all four of these labor forces, the Chinese crews from She Yup and Sam Yup, the Irish and veteran and freedmen laborers on Union Pacific's Plains crews, the Pawnee Scouts who protected them, and the Mormon graders finishing the last miles through Utah's canyons, share is a documentary record that treats them as a workforce rather than as individuals. Company payroll books tracked hours and wages by crew and contractor. They were not designed to preserve a family tree, and for 150 years they did not need to. Genealogists trying to reconstruct these lines today work from whatever survived alongside those payroll books, ship manifests, county tax rolls, naturalization petitions filed decades after the fact, family Bibles, and increasingly, DNA test results submitted by descendants who often had no idea a railroad connection existed until a document search or a genetic match pointed them toward it. The county of origin recorded for a Chinese laborer, when it survives at all, can now be checked against the regional ancestry estimates. A commercial DNA test returns for southern Guangdong. An Irish surname on a Union Pacific payroll can be checked against the county of origin. A Y chromosome test suggests for a male line carrying that name today. None of it proves a specific individual connection on its own. Together, record and genome start to narrow the range of what a family's unwritten history probably was. The scale involved is not small. Between the two companies, somewhere close to 20,000 men worked on the Transcontinental Line at its construction peak in 1868 and 1869. Assume conservatively that each of them produced across 5 or 6 generations even a modest number of descendants, and the number of living Americans who carry some thread back to this specific workforce runs into the millions, scattered now across every region of the country rather than concentrated along the line their ancestors built. Most of those descendants have never been told which crew, which county, or which surname connects them to the railroad, because the connection itself was never written down in a form meant to last. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The ceremony at Promontory Summit on May 10th was planned with the kind of choreography railroads use to sell the idea of progress to the public. Telegraph wires were run directly to the site so that the final spike, wired to send a signal the instant it was struck, could notify the entire country in real time. Leland Stanford took the ceremonial swing with a silver hammer at a golden spike specially cast for the occasion, missed the spike entirely on his first attempt according to several accounts, and the telegraph operator sent the word done anyway rather than let the moment fall flat. Bells rang in San Francisco, cannons fired in Washington. Newspapers across the country ran the story the next morning as the day the nation became, physically, one piece. Andrew Russell's photograph of the two locomotives meeting became the image people still associate with that day, and it shows exactly who Central Pacific and Union Pacific wanted associated with their achievement. Company officials, white laborers, a handful of railroad executives passing a bottle back and forth on the cowcatcher of one of the engines. Chinese laborers who had graded and blasted and laid nearly all of the western half of that line, and who had, 12 days earlier, set the record for the fastest mile of track ever laid by hand, are not identifiable in the image at all. Contemporary accounts mention a small number of Chinese workers present at the ceremony, but the photograph that defined how Americans would remember the day left them out of the frame entirely, and for close to a century and a half, that omission simply became the accepted shape of the story. For most of the 20th century, that erasure held. School textbooks that mentioned the Transcontinental Railroad at all tended to describe crews and mileage rather than the men doing the work, and the golden spike photograph was reproduced often enough that its cropped version of the workforce became, by default, the workforce most Americans pictured. That started to shift only in the past few decades, as descendants of Chinese railroad workers began organizing reunions, submitting oral histories to university archives, and pressing for the historical record to include what the photograph left out. In 2014, on the 145th anniversary of the Golden Spike ceremony, descendants of Chinese railroad workers were invited to Promontory Summit as recognized guests of the commemoration for the first time, some of them carrying photographs of ancestors whose full names family history had never fully recovered, standing at the same spot where the original ceremony had left their great-great-grandfathers out of frame. The National Park Service, which now manages the site as Golden Spike National Historic Site, holds an annual reenactment of the ceremony every May, and in recent years that reenactment has specifically included descendant groups and Chinese cultural organizations absent from the event in 1869 by omission rather than by choice. It cannot restore the names still missing from the payroll ledgers, but it stands, a century and a half later, as acknowledgement that those names were always supposed to be there. What happened to the Chinese railroad workforce after the last spike went in tells its own part of the story. Central Pacific no longer needed 12,000 men once the line was finished, and many of the same workers moved on to other Western railroad construction, to Sierra mining operations, or to agricultural labor in the Central Valley. Anti-Chinese violence intensified through the 1870s and 1880s across the American West, with organized expulsions driving Chinese residents out of towns in Washington, Oregon, Wyoming, and California, sometimes at gunpoint, sometimes by arson. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, barring nearly all new immigration from China and preventing Chinese immigrants already in the country from becoming naturalized citizens. It was the first major federal law to exclude an immigrant group by name, and it stayed in force for more than 60 years. The combination of violence and legal exclusion pushed many railroad-era Chinese immigrants toward the same handful of West Coast Chinatowns for safety and toward occupations, laundries, restaurants, small groceries that required less exposure to hostile white communities than railroad or mining camps had. Families that could afford it sent money and eventually children back to the home villages in Sayup and Samyup, rather than risk raising the next generation inside a country that had just written their exclusion into federal law. Then, on April 18, 1906, an earthquake and the fires that followed it destroyed most of San Francisco, including the Hall of Records where the city's birth certificates and immigration files were kept. With no surviving documents to check a claim against, any Chinese immigrant who told authorities he had been born in San Francisco before the fire had, for practical purposes, an unchallengeable claim to American citizenship, since the paperwork that could have disproved it no longer existed. Word of this reached Guangdong quickly, and out of it grew what genealogists and historians now call the paper son system. Men in China purchased documentation identifying them as the sons of Chinese immigrants already established in the United States, sometimes real relatives, more often strangers willing to sell a family slot for a fee, and immigrated under those purchased names rather than their own. For the families involved, the paper name usually became the only name their American descendants ever knew. A great-grandfather who entered the country in 1914 as the paper son of a man named Wang might have been born a Chin or a Li, and unless someone in the family specifically preserved the original name, generations of descendants grow up believing Wang was always the family's name, with no reason to suspect otherwise until a DNA test returns cousin matches under a completely different surname, or a village elder during a visit to Guangdong mentions a family story that does not match what the American branch has always been told. Some of those original names trace directly back to the railroad camps 2 generations earlier. Most do not, since the paper son system mainly involved immigrants arriving decades after the transcontinental line was finished. But the same conditions, an incomplete written record, a name changed under pressure, a document destroyed by circumstance, run through both stories. Genealogists working Chinese-American family trees today treat a paper name almost as a starting hypothesis rather than a fact, something to be tested against village genealogy books, association records, and increasingly against DNA matches to cousins who kept, or later recovered, the original surname on the other side of the Pacific. A family that has called itself Wang for 4 generations may find its closest genetic matches clustering under Chin or Li instead, the genome holding a detail the paperwork was built to obscure. Since the early 2000s, a research effort based at Stanford University has worked specifically to recover what the payroll ledgers left out, cross-referencing Chinese language sources, family association records kept in San Francisco and in Guangdong villages, and oral histories collected from descendants before the last of them are gone. The project has identified individual names, home villages, and in some cases direct descendants for workers who existed in the historical record only as an entry in a labor gang count for 130 years. Much of that work happens through descendant interviews rather than archives alone, since a family that kept an oral tradition, a home village name repeated at holidays, a grandfather's nickname, a fragment of a work song, can sometimes supply the detail no ledger recorded. Researchers then check that fragment against Chinese language sources most American archives never collected in the first place, association membership books kept in San Francisco's Chinatown, temple donor plaques, village genealogy registers maintained in Guangdong that in some cases predate the railroad by centuries. A match confirmed this way rarely arrives as a single document. It arrives as an accumulation, a village name that fits the labor recruitment pattern, a surname that fits the village, a family story that fits the timeline, each piece unremarkable alone and only convincing once several of them line up. On the Union Pacific side, the trail is easier to walk but no more complete. Irish surnames common on the Plains construction crews, Casey, Sullivan, Riley, Doyle, Kilcoyne, are common today across exactly the states the railroad opened, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Utah, at rates noticeably higher than their share of the Irish-American population nationally, a pattern consistent with a founder population that arrived, worked, and in a meaningful number of cases simply stayed, rather than returning east. The same holds for German and Scandinavian surnames, concentrated along the same corridor, Larson, Anderson, Becker, Hoffman, families whose earliest documented presence in Nebraska or Wyoming lines up, generation for generation, with a great-great-grandfather's arrival to work construction rather than to farm, a distinction most descendants no longer draw, because farming is what the family did for the next 150 years afterward. Utah's own founding surnames sit alongside these in a stranger position, publicly tied to religious settlement rather than railroad labor, even where the same men appear in both stories, graders one season and settlers for the rest of their lives. Surname distribution maps do similar work for families who left behind less centralized records than the Chinese labor camps did. County-by-county census data from the decades right after the railroad's completion shows exactly where a name like Kilcoyne or Larson first clusters in the American West, and that cluster typically forms within one or two counties of a rail depot rather than spreading evenly across a state, a pattern that matches construction labor settling near the line rather than families arriving independently for farmland. When a name shows this kind of tight geographic origin point along the old grade, genealogists treat it as circumstantial evidence of a railroad connection even before any single document names the ancestor specifically. Irish surnames carried their own quieter version of the same erasure. Many arrived in America already stripped of the O apostrophe or Mac prefix that had marked them in Ireland, a simplification some families made themselves to sound less foreign to potential employers, and some immigration clerks made without asking. O'Kelly became Kelly. MacSullivan had usually already become Sullivan generations earlier under English rule in Ireland itself, long before any ship crossed the Atlantic. On a Union Pacific crew roster, a name might appear in yet a third spelling, phonetic to whichever clerk happened to be writing that week, so a single family can turn up in county records under 2 or 3 variants depending on which document survived. None of this rises to the scale of a purchased paper name or a lost Chinese surname recorded only as a nickname, but it belongs to the same pattern, a name simplified, shortened, or respelled under pressure from a system with no particular interest in getting it exactly right. A descendant today checking a DNA match against a family tree sometimes has to search 2 or 3 spellings before the match makes sense. For a descendant sitting with a DNA test result today, the practical question is rarely as simple as whether an ancestor worked on the railroad. It is closer to which version of the family name to trust, the one on the citizenship papers, the one in the family Bible, or the one a cousin match under a different spelling seems to be pointing toward. Commercial ethnicity estimates are not built to flag a 19th century railroad crew specifically. They return a regional percentage, southern China, Ireland, Scandinavia, the Mountain West, and leave the historical explanation for that percentage to the person reading it. A family that is always identified simply as Chinese American or simply as Irish American may be looking at a percentage on a cousin list that only makes sense once the railroad and the specific county or country the recruitment pulled from enters the picture as the explanation nobody had written down. None of this collapses into a single tidy revelation the way a DNA test result sometimes promises to. The Chinese laborer whose real name a paper son certificate replaced, the Irish veteran who took a Union Pacific paycheck without stating which side he had fought for in a war that had ended 2 years earlier, the Pawnee Scout whose service is on record in more detail than the white laborers he protected, the Mormon grader still owed money by a railroad that finished its line and moved on. None of these stories resolves into something simpler than it was. What connects them is the same missing signature. A company that needed labor, not lineage, kept records built for wages and mileage, not for grandchildren. The line got built. The names mostly did not survive the trip. If a family story places an ancestor on that line, in a Sierra Tunnel crew, on a Nebraska grading gang, in a Pawnee Scout company, or on a Utah contract with Brigham Young's name attached to it, the surname carried today may or may not be the one that ancestor actually used. What usually does survive, in a county of origin, a regional DNA match, or a company ledger entry that never quite matches the family name, is enough of a thread that a modern test, or a modern search through the kind of records this railroad left behind, can sometimes still find it. The photograph from Promontory Summit still hangs in textbooks and museum walls, little changed from the version printed the week it was taken, workers and officials crowded onto two locomotives with the mountains behind them. Most of what built the harder half of that scene is not visible in the frame, and most of what carried the workforce east from Omaha is visible only in outline, a crowd of men in coats and hats indistinguishable from each other unless a name happens to survive attached to a face. The line they built together still runs, more or less, along the same corridor today. The names attached to the men who built it are still being recovered, one county, one ledger, one DNA match at a time. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.